Hey everyone. Tonight we begin with the fascinating lives and incredible tenacity of medieval peasants. The everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most horrific nights in history. From homemade insulating methods to shared sleeping strategies, their narrative is one of courage, inventiveness, and determination. So, before you get comfortable, take a time to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually love what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what hour it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that nice background hum, and let's relax into tonight's voyage together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and joyous festivals. But for the common peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about how do we not perish tonight. It wasn't just a season, it was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an extremely vicious teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this. You're living in a tiny mud and stick cabin with walls so thin you could definitely hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows unless you include a little hole stuffed with animal hide, and definitely no thermostat disputes with your siblings. The internal temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was frigid outdoors, it was politely, marginally less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness enveloped everything. The wind howled like a furious ghost, and the fire in the hearth flickered miserably, doing its best, but primarily simply burning the toes of whoever was seated closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camped outside with inferior snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own luxurious fur coats or goose-down blankets. You possessed a couple of rough, spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled vaguely like goat, and a hope that layering them would convert you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it didn't actually work. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were sometimes nothing more than sacks loaded with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes tossed in for good measure, and bonus some fleas for added company. Luxury thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't simply uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were continual hazards, especially for young children. Every morning that you woke up still living was considered a minor miracle, and honestly worth celebrating. Maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yeah, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every item of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the true journey, it was just beginning. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close correctly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their dwellings weren't only drafty, they were basically really energetic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant dwellings were what historians kindly term blel and dorb construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a large basket, coated with a lovely mixture of mud, straw, and animal excrement. Yes, dung. They weren't attempting to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, it was always readily available, should we say. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't have much chance against a good winter storm. The frigid wind found every crevice, every opening, and joyously danced its way inside the one-room houses, swirling about and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Certainly not. Warmth? Not really. Character developing? Sure. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked attractive, certainly, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally allowed in the local fauna. Nothing says lovely evening like a squirrel dropping onto your supper. Windows, if they existed at all, were absurdly tiny and were covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't buy more than a single little pane. And peasants, they were just thrilled if the wind didn't take the cowhide right off the wall mid-storm. To make matters worse, floors were typically just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed excessively, muck crept up through the ground. So theoretically, you could say they had internal water features. Not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trekking across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional attack on your body heat. It oozed up from the dirt, like a nasty little ghost worming its way through the straw into your bones and straight into your own soul. If you dropped something onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this gloomy conflict in a few ways. One option was putting thick mats of straw over the floor if you could afford it, or more realistically, if you could steal enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting discovered, you might have a reasonable insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast, turned moldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already dismal nights. Some homes put dried rushes onto the earth instead. Every so often, they would dump fresh rushes on top without sweeping out the old ones. Over time, this formed an interesting ecology of rotting plants, fleas, and whatever unknown species wanted to settle in. It was basically medieval carpet padding, if your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve anything. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of comfy mattresses, you had prodding, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and prevent freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the frigid earth so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A nice night's sleep wasn't about dreams or tenderness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, great, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls or even the daring layers of earth and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a blazing, tenacious fire pit that served as the sole, genuine barrier against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval existence. At the core of practically every peasant home was a modest fire. No fireplace with a gorgeous stone mantel, no clean chimney sending the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a rudimentary pit or pile of stones, some half-burnt logs, and enough smoke flowing into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right. Most dwellings didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through little gaps in the roof, crevices in the walls, or even into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't great for breathing or your overall longevity, but on the positive side, it performed a terrific job of fumigating fleas and other unwelcome guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 247? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and occasionally even the medieval counterpart of a television. People sat around the fire sharing stories, talking, or just staring into the flames, since really there wasn't much else to do after nightfall. Keeping the fire alive wasn't only a lovely concept, it was mandatory. Letting the fire fade out at night was like putting up a sign inviting the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as straightforward as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the household had a duty: stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or, if you were lucky, a beautiful piece of dry wood. It was a perpetual war between human persistence and the stifling cold that wanted nothing more than to wipe you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was just impossible. It was a hazy, flickering, frequently disappointing little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants hated more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire burn out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in swiftly, then a tax collector after harvest. And in the midst of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't only inconvenient, it might be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters, dream on. Rekindling a fire entailed striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that flame with gentle affection and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days earlier. Imagine trying to do all this in the chilly dark, half asleep, with frozen fingertips. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra encouragement, so peasants became savvy. They banked the fire. No, not in a nice savings account. Banking means carefully burying the embers behind a mound of ash immediately before bed. The ash behaved like a blanket, shielding the flaming coals and keeping them alive, just barely, till daylight. If you did it right, you could wander over at sunrise, prod the pile a little, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to kid, like a precious family dish. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some advised use dry ash only. Others thought a touch of wetness was key. Some packed the embers firmly, others let them breathe. You might virtually start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking approach. It was the old version of debating over barbecue skill, except with somewhat higher survival stakes. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A roaring wind might creep through a crevice and snuff it out anyhow, or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to inspect the coals. Basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about managing nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your win right there, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the expression, "the more the merrier," wasn't simply about partying. It was a winter survival method. When the fire sputtered and the frigid winds whistled through every gap, there was one definite source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbors' cattle, and possibly a very bewildered goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a notion. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire houses packed into the warmest section of the home, covered in whatever shreds of material they could find, and formed what could only be described as a frantic, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids fit in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel turned up unexpectedly, well, there was always place for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of lying next to the entrance of a meat locker. And woe to the one who moved too much throughout the night. You move once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the frigid draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're officially the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared. It said a communal straw mattress that steadily flattened beneath the nightly weight of numerous generations. And considering hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being fussy. Body heat wasn't just wonderful, it was strategic. Some medieval instructions even advocated purposely putting the strongest, warmest people on the exterior of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and fragile elderly were snuggled deep in the middle, treated like the precious tiny heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family connection. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and likely some very intriguing talks muffled under a shared wool blanket. So, next time your sister takes your blanket, or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow room between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. D's, cows, goats, pigs, chicks, basically anything with a heartbeat and a tiny bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quaint rural practice, it was important for survival. Livestock created warmth, and in a poorly insulated hell where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was significantly less likely to get stolen by a neighbor in the dark of night. 2 birds, 1 smelly stone. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nestled in nooks, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged comfortably against the walls, eating cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. If you've ever been stranded in a car on a summer road trip with someone who failed to shower, imagine that. But it's a cow. It's winter, and there's simply nowhere else to go. The smell's legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter was something strong. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't protest much, since they knew one disagreeable reality. The more animals inside, the fewer freezing toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime places. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, frequently took center stage near the family. Goats were let closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, will find a way inside regardless. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down anywhere they chose, presumably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your sleep with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine dozing off quietly, only to be forcibly awakened by a fowl deciding your hair makes a nice perch, or slipping barefoot into something strange first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings may be full of surprises. Still, despite the cacophony, the odors, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills, and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's frigid fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the decisive factor between life and death. In medieval winters, dress wasn't about looking attractive, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't browsing through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for a fight against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was straightforward. If you possessed it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, presumably not too clean linen shirt. Over it, a heavier woolen tunic. Then another. If you had it, add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a ragged cloak slung over your shoulders, and, if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheep hide thrown on top like a prized trophy. Congratulations, you are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of linen or old rags and placed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothing in the midst of winter required carrying them to a frozen creek, bashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't merely freeze into a sad shirt cycle, most peasants sensibly judged that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a minor price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the grime and oil buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That filthy coating sealed in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, except smellier and significantly less socially acceptable. Now, hats, scarves, and gloves were cherished treasures. A simple woolen cap could spell the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often handmade from whatever bits of leather or fabric someone could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet outfits than anything trendy. Children were especially swaddled till they resembled overstuffed turnips waddling awkwardly around the home. The idea was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the true medieval flex. So the next time you whine about bundling up for a chilly day, just recall medieval peasants wandered around wearing half their clothing at once, looking like lumpy laundry sacks, and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant handbook, filth wasn't just something you washed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting dirty wasn't an indication you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say, brilliance. See, winter offered a very special problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially newly laundered linen, were unexpectedly bad at keeping you warm. They were breathable, granted, but when the air temperature hung somewhere between hypothermia and quick regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants struggled through day after day without washing their garments, layers of filth, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned muck began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor closed the microscopic holes in the fabric, making garments more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, except smellier. Sure, you smelt like a goat that lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval inhabitants felt that washing yourself too regularly in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even unusual, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for significant occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the approach, peasants layered their clothing without changing the ones underneath. You merely slapped your fresh layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the last 6 weeks. Every stain telling the amazing story of that one time I slipped in the mud, but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had entirely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew otherwise. That dirty, crusty garment was a thermal buffer from death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a society where absolutely everyone stank to high sky, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was essentially a way of life. So yeah, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters snuggled into comfortable feather mattresses with embroidered quilts, think again. The truth was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean, let's lay on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant life were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes.
That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mixture that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night produced a wonderful soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a stray stalk. Some peasants even bypassed the wooden frame altogether and just dumped the straw straight onto the dirt floor, producing a luxury, groundly sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't only uncomfortable, they were transient. Over time, the straw flattened, got moldy, attracted bugs, and basically turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a significant occasion, normally done a few times a year if you were vigilant, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your consent. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were placed thick on the floor, often blended with plants like lavender or rosemary to offset the overwhelming smelly and smells of daily living. Fresh rushes smelled great for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled terrain inside the house, mixing perfectly with dirt, food crumbs, and anything else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other lovely insects enjoyed straw beds just as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living the true medieval experience. Despite the trials, these simple beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw offered a key insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clustering together atop them formed pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating at its finest. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't merely resist the cold from the outside, they fought it from within their own homes. armed with nothing but whatever they could fit into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, dirt collapsed, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new areas to sneak in every night, like a sly poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants packed gaps with moss, straw, remnants of old cloth, bundles of dried grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was shoved into a hole someplace. Some extremely dedicated folks daubed extra layers of mud and manure over the outside of their walls as an annual winter job. Imagine standing there in frigid weather, slapping cold manure over your own house while murmuring, "This is fine. This is luxury." Because in a way, it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while inexpensive and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would fill holes in the ceiling with spare scraps of cloth, bundles of straw, or, in moments of great desperation, chunks of turf seized from the neighboring field. Every residence gradually started to appear like a slightly sad patchwork quilt, fashioned by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors, windows. If you had them, you were lucky, but even then they were hardly more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window apertures were often covered with animal hides or thick linen soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts and offer an additional perfume of mysterious meat to the living room. Every night was a war between human inventiveness and the unrelenting, insidious cold. One minute you were toasty, the next minute a quick gust would discover the one spot you missed, smacking you awake like a chilly hand of doom. Yet, nonetheless, through resourcefulness, stubbornness, and a reluctance to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the harshest winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even bother to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they established a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some huge, structured system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more urgent. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half cuddled up behind threadbare blankets and hay, attempting to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen slumber. The fire demanded regular monitoring. Left alone, it would die down, and reviving it, recall, was about as easy as persuading an obstinate donkey to dance. So, someone had to be on ember patrol. And since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families switched shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life while trying not to trip on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minute snooze buttons. Just sore joints, heavy eyelids, and a rising anger toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to grasp a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter, everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes sat by the fire longer, both because of their experience and plainly because arthritis made lying down and rising up again a tremendous effort. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck with people moving about, animals rustling, wind assaulting the walls, and the occasional harsh nudge from a sibling who mistakenly rolled over too hard. Getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet, despite the tiredness, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and frigid, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you gripe about waking up to change the temperature or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant, gazing into a burning fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really that significant. After all, you know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't merely resist the chilly air with cloaks, fireplaces, and innovative sleeping arrangements. They even altered the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was straightforward. Deep, open-mouthed inhaling sucked chilly air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say Hail Mary, that was a gamble nobody wanted to take. So, peasants mastered the technique of what you may term survival breathing. Instead of drawing in enormous gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most essential, via the nose. The goal was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it entered their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally swallowed a big mouthful of frigid air, congratulations, you just bought yourself a ticket to a week of carving up chunks of what felt like your soul with no physicians inside, and Granny treating you with hot onion tea and stern prayers. Some individuals even wrapped portions of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, forming a makeshift breath warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy cloth patch adhering to your mouth by morning. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these skills early on. Parents would chastise little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the winter months. And honestly, between stringent breathing lessons, itchy wool coverings, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, curled into straw bedding behind mounds of cloaks and close to a slowly simmering cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible. Like some terrible medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer uplifting remarks. In the larger survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest plan, but it worked. One short breath at a time, peasants weathered another night in the long, merciless struggle against cold. In the continuous war against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unusual hidden weapon: a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was gorging yourself with something meaty and heavy right before bed. Calories represented warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the effort. It's classic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a big meal, produce internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So, what would medieval peasants load onto their plates before a long, frigid night? Think rich stews packed with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were very lucky, perhaps after a celebration day or a generous slaughter, you may even get a bit of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage put into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No fine presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It was one gigantic, faintly brown dinner designed to settle in your gut like a friendly brick, steadily burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't simply about eating a lot. It was about eating intelligently. Foods that took longer to digest offered a gentle, steady drip of warmth. Fatty foods were highly lauded, not simply for the calories they provided, but because fat burned slower than lean meat. A gut full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of grease.
peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate thoroughly. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh but successful parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy midnight eating came with its own hazards. You might feel warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, odd dreams, powered by a stomach straining hard to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't striving for a Michelin star feast. They were striving to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the unending effort to see another chilly daybreak. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little additional warmth at nighttime. And that's how the simple hay box and the ever-gorgeous heating stone became winter's hidden heroes. Let's start with the hay box. It sounds rough, and it really was. But the notion was pure genius. Peasants would take a robust wooden box, line it generously with hay, and use it to hold food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, dump it into the hay box, cover it up, and it kept hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized if hay could capture the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even greater: rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, possibly whatever poor youngster lost the family fight, would grab a flat stone and toss it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a delicate line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out with a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating pleasant warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of fabric, or packed into a clay pot, then slid beneath the hay in the mattress, or down at the foot of the bed, a medieval heating pad, preparing to do fight against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations, you now have a minor, localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that stone provided exquisite, reassuring warmth that might endure for hours. It wasn't lavish, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the broad arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock buried inside some hay might not sound fancy, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a minor miracle. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cook meals. It was practically a family member, a temperamental, smoky, sometimes disagreeable family member, certainly, but nonetheless vitally essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That means sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or feeble had first dibs on great real estate. Capital parents, older kids, and sturdier people fanned out from there like human insulating layers. Being offered a seat close to the fire wasn't just politeness. It was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, while seniors were treasured reservoirs of family wisdom, and let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with excellent warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all nice toasting by the flames. You did too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak burning suspiciously. Too far, and you were effectively camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you suddenly looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't disseminate warmth evenly. It largely scorched the people right in front of it, while everyone else struggled over the tight cone of heat like frigid lizards vying for a sunlight. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one pleasantly warm side, and one side frozen so firm you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in, too. A dog might position itself between you and the fire, tail waving dangerously close to open flame. Chickens often perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking quietly into the night, like small, feathered protectors of warmth. Every snap of the logs, every shift of flaming embers was a tiny hope. You're still alive. You're still warm. For now. And so peasants slipped into uncomfortable sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath producing little clouds in the freezing air beyond the fire's tenuous circle. It wasn't flawless. It wasn't pleasant. But it was life, holding to warmth by a thread of blazing coals. In the medieval period, no one survived winter alone, unless they wanted to become a very elegant frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't only a family concern, it was a village project. A dirty, muddy, boisterous cooperation where everyone's warmth and survival depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the depth of winter, a big fire and a mound of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly ceased curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not only because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the old who couldn't work the fields, but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't gone to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a bit too silent in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the luminous vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A nice neighbor would run over with a burning coal, bundled in rags, or better still, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant cramming an extra 4 persons into an already tiny room, but it was better than finding frozen buddies come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During extremely severe winters, villagers occasionally pulled their last preserved meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was awful charity. No one had much, yet a few common meals may be the difference between limping into spring or not. Even children understand the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran critical messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too fatigued when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds occurred, disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose nice cooking kettle never completely went away. But when the nights turned deadly cold, old grievances were frequently discreetly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth preserving, because tomorrow it might be you seeking rescue. In the frigid heart of winter, the community became one large, defiant family, sometimes chaotic, often humorous, always passionately determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling flame, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants confronted the severe cold of winter, they didn't just put on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed a lot, because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire dwindled into sullen embers, you wanted every possible edge, including a little supernatural assistance. Faith wasn't only a Sunday event back then. It was braided throughout every frozen breath. Before snuggling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, giving up quick prayers to keep the fire going, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than remote religious figures. They were winter's front-line defense. Same, for instance, was called upon to defend against throat diseases. Not a minor problem when one mouthful of frigid air may land you coughing up your soul. St. Nicholas wasn't merely the jovial gift-giver of later folklore. He was also urged to preserve households from sudden bankruptcy during the lean, dangerous months. Superstitions curled themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water on the hearth before retiring, assuming it would protect against evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others inscribed doorways with blessed chalk after particular feast days, begging for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, frequently blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the community, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just help us through this night, I swear I'll be better to my neighbor, especially the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent talk. The peasants weren't clamoring for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring loosened the freezing grip on their tiny settlements. It was basic, raw hope spoken into the smoky rafters, knotted in breathless prayers and buried under itchy blankets that somehow got them through the endless, cruel nights of winter. For all the inventiveness, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants flung at winter, the truth was chilly. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And when winter won, it didn't only take a few unlucky victims, it took entire families, whole villages, disappearing them into stillness beneath a heavy cloud of snow and ice. Some winters were extremely severe, like the famed Great Famine winter of 1315, when rains damaged crops, livestock starved, and frigid temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather,
bark, and, in the most terrible cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't only an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's little warmth, families huddled together for the final time. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across complete households in spring. Bodies remained engaged in one another's frozen embrace, as if striving to share just a bit more heat till the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or hammering ice storms. A roof giving apart in the middle of a freezing night wasn't merely tragic, it was often lethal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee either. Especially if those neighbors were already stretched beyond the breaking point. Disease loved the cold too. Starvation weakened the body, and tight, smoky dwellings developed into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lethal illnesses. A slight cough in December may easily be a funeral by January. And then there came the quiet horror, frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears darkened and perished while still attached to their owners. Some peasants survived winters at the cost of their limbs, a terrible badge of pride that declared, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." Yet, what's most frightening isn't just the death, it's the eerie normally of it. People accepted that each winter, some of them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It was simply another neighbor at the door, coated in frost, waiting its turn. Even amid the severe cold and frequent threat, medieval peasants pressed on, tenacious, grieving, clinging to life. Because as long as there was one ember remaining in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frigid air, there was still a war worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frostbitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their miseries, the cracked hands, the cold toes, the smoke-clogged homes. But hidden beneath all that battle is something considerably more powerful, a heritage of raw, tenacious ingenuity and indomitable endurance. They didn't have central heating, warm coats, or nice memory foam beds. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the template for resilience. Every haystead mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-scrammed wall crevice was a tribute to human innovation under hardship. Faced with overwhelming odds, they didn't fall in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the hard lessons cut by each brutal winter. Their societies were formed on more than common land. They were built on common survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pull resources when food ran low, to trust that assisting a freezing neighbor now meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their religion, too, was a form of perseverance. They wove prayers into their everyday lives, not only out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, persistent hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 long nights, spring would come again and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous wins, surviving one more night, one more storm, subsequent generations prospered. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed civilization forward, enduring winters their predecessors could barely survive until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and genius are sewn invisibly into the lives we live now. Every nice blanket, every warm house, every languid winter evening spent sipping tea under bright lights, all of it is the end result of innumerable medieval peasants refusing to give in to the cold. So the next time the wind blows outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them. The unknown fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one tenacious heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head or soldiers at her feet. Born in 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hay Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious ambassador, and Elizabeth Howard, an aristocratic woman with extensive family relations. In the grand sweep of Tudor society, Anne's birth scarcely created a ripple. Yet from these modest beginnings, something spectacular was taking root. A life that will one day skew the direction of English history. From an early age, Anne was marked apart, not by her money, but by her brains. She was intelligent, energetic, and by all accounts magnetic. Recognizing her promise, her family sent her overseas to the continent, where her schooling truly began. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the brilliant court of the Netherlands, an experience few English females could dream of. There, Anne absorbed the skill of diplomacy, polished manners, and the intricate dance of European politics. But it was in France that Anne's genius was properly honed. She spent years in the aristocratic courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirting, wit. While other young women refined their stitching, Anne mastered conversation, intrigue, and the knack of commanding attention without ever seeming to seek it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was something unusual. A lady who could challenge the refinement of European courtiers while bearing the ambition of a rising English dynasty. She wasn't a traditional beauty. Even her fans confessed as much. Yet she was arresting. Dark eyes that flashed with intelligence, a rapid musical voice, a style of movement that implied purpose just barely veiled beneath layers of courtly grace. Anne didn't just enter rooms, she shifted their gravity. At a time when a woman's fate was often decided by birth and marriage, Anne refused to slip quietly into obscurity. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield at other courts, and she meant to exploit that knowledge at home. Anne Boleyn was still a young woman then, intelligent, ambitious, untested. But history was already beginning to stir around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a greater game, one that would soon consume the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had ever seen. In a world full of pale-faced, demure English roses, Anne was a thunderstorm, electrifying, unexpected, impossible to ignore.
Her black hair, bold eyes, and quick, keen wit set her distinct from the mild, obedient females who occupied the court of King Henry VIII. At first, she fulfilled the role expected of her, a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even under the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too bright to snuff out. She danced smoothly, spoke French with the ease of a native, and laughed with a confidence few women dared express. Men noticed. Women gossiped. The court buzzed softly about the attractive Berlin girl. It wasn't long until she drew the most deadly attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and covert romance. But Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his comments or fall quickly into his arms like so many others had. She teased, she challenged, she refused. Henry, a man used to instant adoration, was captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the deeper he fell. Letters passed between them, loaded with protestations of love, frustration, longing. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the most powerful, unofficial position at court. Anne astonishingly said no. She would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry desired her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a risk so bold that it astonished the court. After all, the monarch was already married. His queen, Catherine, was liked by the people and jealously protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be challenged for Henry to claim Anne. But Anne didn't flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens wielded subtle authority from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a hazardous game, but it was a game she meant to win. Standing in the candle-lit hallways of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her choice. Not to be just adored, but to change her destiny and England's forever. What began as an intense infatuation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon turned into a national disaster. Henry wasn't only besotted, he was obsessed. And in his fanaticism, he was eager to break up everything England had known for centuries. The king's intention to marry Anne met a tiny roadblock. Namely, he was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to gently move aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the lawful queen. Divorce wasn't simply controversial, it was practically unfathomable. But Henry was determined. He deluded himself and sought to convince everyone else that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, since she had once been married to his brother Arthur, never mind that the Pope had granted special approval for their nuptials years before. Henry now insisted that his soul was damned unless he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her part, knew better than to appear too eager. She maintained herself just out of reach, alternately fueling Henry's hopes and keeping her distance. Every gaze, every word was measured. She wasn't only aiming for marriage, she was positioned herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted into whispers and factions. Some noble families actively courted Anne's favor, feeling the winds of power moving. Others held strongly to Queen Catherine, appalled by the notion of Anne replacing her. Diplomats wrote urgent letters back to Rome. Foreign kings threatened reprisal. Henry's own council shifted uneasily, sensing the ground vibrating beneath their feet. As months stretched into years, Henry's frustration mounted. He inundated the Pope with petitions, coached his attorneys into discovering loopholes, and slowly began to realize that the Church would not bow easy. Catherine had powerful allies, notably her nephew, Emperor Charles V,
the most powerful man in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on, ignoring prudence, custom, and increasingly the law itself. His courtship with Anne had become something far more than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the entire structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't only capturing a king's heart, she was dragging an entire kingdom into new waters. A perilous game had begun, and there could be no turning back. After nearly 7 tortuous years of wrangling, scandal, and diplomatic catastrophe, Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII. A brave move, given that he was still formally married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and many of Europe. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life, but the atmosphere was far from universally cheerful. The citizens of London observed with weary eyes. Some cheered, others mumbled prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French mannerisms and bold personality, was a blessing or a curse. Anne entered her queenship not as a revered character, but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who exemplified traditional English virtues of humility and piety, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and politically smart. She donned vibrant colors, controlled the court with acute intelligence, and made formidable adversaries with astounding quickness. Her position, while appearing solid, was also terrifyingly precarious. Everything rested on one thing: supplying Henry with a male heir. Anne knew this as vividly as anyone. She was not only Henry's lover anymore, she was the hope of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were ecstatic, certain the kid would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she hid her devastating disappointment with grace, saying the next kid would undoubtedly be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. His eyes, once full of affection, now flashed with mistrust. Still, for a time, Anne's star shone brilliantly. She remade the English court in her image, lifting her family to unparalleled heights, and becoming the first queen in English history. Crowned with the precious oil typically reserved for royalty, her influence was immense. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor. Couriers reshuffled alliances to be in her good graces. The once submissive Henry began pulling England officially away from Rome, founding the Church of England with himself at its head. All so that Anne's crown could not be questioned. Yet even amid her triumph, black clouds formed. Friends muttered behind their hands. Rivals surrounded, waiting, and Henry, fickle and restless, was already beginning to look past the clever woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had won the crown, but preserving it would need more than charm, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had ascended higher than nearly any lady of her day, but the higher you ascend, the harder the fall. Almost from the time she placed the crown on her head, the flaws in her universe began to show. At the heart of Anne's troubles was the expectation to produce a male successor. Her first child, Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son Henry V had set his dynastic dreams upon, and the clock was ticking. Anne suffered many pregnancies in quick succession, but grief followed. Miscarriages that left her physically weakened and mentally traumatized. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had constructed. Henry, once fiercely dedicated, began to pull away.
his dissatisfaction digging rifts between them. Anne, never one to suffer in silence, protested, demanded, struggled to preserve her place. But Henry, a man who treasured obedience as much as beauty, became bored of her sharpness, her defiance, the very fire that had once drew him in. Outside the royal rooms, adversaries were swarming like wolves. Many nobility who had tolerated Anne's ascension with clenched teeth now openly schemed for her ruin. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave Anne for what they perceived as theft and sacrilege. Even commoners spoke against her, calling her the Great, blaming her for the rupture with Rome and the heavy-handed measures that followed. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, demure, everything Anne was not, Jane captivated Henry's wandering interest, just as Anne's influence began to wane. Where Anne had wowed him with brilliance and challenge, Jane gave quiet submission. It was a perilous transition, and Anne, alert as ever, sensed it occurring. She sought to restore her place, lavishing attention on Henry, promising more boys, begging for patience. But the king, ever fickle, had already begun envisioning life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's political rivals, especially Thomas Cromwell, previously her ally, felt the turning trend. They began preparing the groundwork for a campaign of annihilation, quietly gathering charges, rumors, and witnesses. The lady who had played the risky game of ambition so brilliantly was now losing ground. Anne had achieved her crown through cunning and courage, but in the ruthless shifting environment of Henry's court, prior successes mattered little. Only fresh success counted, and Anne's foes were sharpening their knives. The queen who had wrecked a kingdom would soon realize how swiftly a kingdom might ruin her. Anne Boleyn's opponents didn't attack her with armies or swords. They arrived with murmurs, secrets, and carefully honed lies. In the back chambers of court, betrayal was fermenting. Silent, patient, lethal. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's strongest ally in the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their union had been built on mutual ambition, but now their objectives collided. Anne desired measures to aid the poor and diminish the influence of rich nobility. Cromwell desired stability, favor with Henry, and no interference. Anne's assertiveness had made her dangerous, and in Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into annoyance, distrust, and frigid detachment. Anne has few actual friends remaining. Even her charm, long her strongest weapon, now grated against the court's thirst for a kinder, more pliable queen. And Jane Seymour, silent and calculating, waited just out of sight. The ideal contrast to Anne's waning fire. It was Cromwell who moved first. Knowing Henry was restless, knowing that the king wanted to exit but lacked a plausible pretext, Cromwell presented a solution. What if Anne could be removed, not by divorce, which would shame Henry, but by disgrace? The accusations were outrageous, terrible, even adultery, incest, conspiracy against the monarch. Anne, the proud, clever queen, depicted as a betrayer, a temptress, a threat to the very crown she once redefined. Cromwell methodically gathered evidence, extracting admissions under torture, turning courtly flirtations into devastating testimony. Several individuals, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were detained. The charges made no sense. They were replete with inconsistencies and impossibilities, but in Henry's court, truth was whatever the monarch required it to be. Anne, sensing the tightening noose, fought frantically. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love they had once shared, but it was no use. The guy who had previously torn England apart for her now refused to face her eyes. In May 1536, Anne was captured and sent to the Tower of London. As the big gate crashed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a harlot, caught in the terrible game she had previously played so expertly. Betrayal had sealed her fate. And now, alone in the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the decisive move. Anne Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobility, many of whom owed their own titles and fortunes to her ascension. Now they sat in judgment, cold and attentive, prepared to obliterate the lady who had once transformed the destiny of England. The charges against her were stunning: adultery with many men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, high treason, conspiracy against the monarch. In another world, such charges against a queen would have been inconceivable. But here, now, they were simply play, a grim show aimed to offer Henry VII exactly what he needed: Anne's collapse cloaked in a thin coat of legitimacy. Anne defended herself with the same fire that had previously captured Henry's love. She denied every claim with intelligence, precision, and an unshakable serenity that astounded even her detractors. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her dedication, her sacrifices, her love. But it was all for nothing. The verdict had been determined long before Anne stepped foot in the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and for the people, a public unmaking of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bought, said scathing remarks. Dates and locales contradicted each other. Evidence was flimsy when it existed at all, but the truth was immaterial anymore. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other males implicated with her were sentenced to death as well. Anne would be executed by beheading, a mild sentence compared to the normal traitor's execution of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was pronounced and did not break, she stood erect, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely strong. In those final minutes before being carried back to her cell, she spoke plainly, indicating that she was prepared to die, and pleaded that God would have pity on her soul. As the massive doors of the hall closed behind her, the court sighed in relief. The storm Anne had been bright, dangerous, unforgettable was soon over. But even then they did not understand. They were not deleting Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in mythology. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once governed England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death. Yet even confronting the end, Anne refused to disintegrate.
In the cold, echoing halls of the tower, Anne prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone flooring, her hands held securely, her voice calm. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the realm and perhaps mercy to her tiny daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few who had stayed loyal, cried in private. Anne comforted them instead of the other way around. She joked angrily at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humor was the persistent flame that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no sign of clemency. He had already switched his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was determined, Henry started organizing his second marriage. For Anne, this ultimate betrayal from the man who had previously torn down a country for her must have been the greatest cut. On May 18th, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had harmed her, and possibly for herself, for the ambition and ego that had led her here. Henry, with a spark of royal mercy, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the death, speedier, cleaner, less violent than an axe. It was a modest mercy bought possibly more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At morning, Anne dressed carefully for her final moment. A dark grey gown of damask, trimmed with fur, a red kirt underneath, colours of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her black hair and slipped it beneath a modest hat, ready to face the blade with grace. As the tower's cold morning mist curled over the courtyard stones, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, walked forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of heroism in the face of history's judgment. Her end was imminent, yet her journey was only beginning. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold placed within the Tower of London's walls. A little crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in quiet, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood upright, her grey gown billowing slightly in the cool morning breeze. She appeared slimmer than she did at court, her face pallid but calm. There were no hysterics, no breaking sobs. If anything, she approached death with the same fiery dignity that had once shaken an empire to its knees. She spoke short, carefully picking her concluding words. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and success, the very man who had abandoned her. In those closing moments, Anne delivered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage astonished even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought particularly to ensure a fast death, stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her gaze lifted toward the heavens. A tiny white handkerchief was put around her eyes. She remained still. The blade flashed once, silent, fast, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history maker, was no more. She was buried hurriedly in an unmarked cemetery within the tower grounds, laid to rest in an arrow box because no appropriate coffin had been made for her. A queen once crowned in gold, now left to vanish without ceremony.
Yet Anne's story didn't finish in that icy tomb. Her daughter Elizabeth, the girl whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen whose reign would see the blooming of English art, power, and global impact. A queen who inherited her mother's strong spirit, brilliant wit, and unshakable resilience. Anne Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her desire helped prompt the break with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England. Her demise taught the world that even queens might be put aside. Yet through her blood, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn won a kind of immortality, not via her survival, but through her indelible imprint on history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies boiled like a pot left too long over a blazing fire. The connection with Britain, once considered as the proud mother country, has turned into resentment, suspicion, and mounting rage. It hadn't started with tea. Years before, the Stamp Act had infuriated colonists by charging levies on everything from newspapers to playing cards. That was followed by the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law passed hundreds of miles away by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation was like another spark landing in barren brush. At first, the indignation revealed itself in polite petitions and angry leaflets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson flooded newspapers with passionate discussions about liberty and rights. But as time drew on, frustration turned into something deeper, a creeping awareness that Britain wasn't listening. Worse, Britain didn't care. Many colonists held to the faith that if they just made enough noise, if they simply reasoned hard enough, Parliament would repeal the taxes, and occasionally they did. The Stamp Act was famously overturned following considerable colonial outcry, but every modest win was followed by new legislation, new levies, new insults. It wasn't about the money, it never really was. The levies themselves were small by British standards. What incensed the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without agreement, treated as subjects rather than citizens, ruled like distant belongings rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the pulsating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a covert, ardent club of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions burst into bloodshed when British soldiers shot on defenseless residents in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones. Trust was a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies were teetering on the verge. A final insult would edge them into open defiance. And it came not in the form of soldiers or new laws or armies, but in the peaceful, seemingly harmless shape of containers packed with tea. The colonists didn't know it yet, but the night that tea floated on the chilly waters of Boston Harbor, the world would alter forever. In 1773, Parliament made a grave miscalculation. Believing the American colonies would silently accept cheaper tea, they approved the Tea Act, a statute that was designed to save the struggling British East India Company and accidentally re-establish Britain's authority to tax the colonies. On paper, it looked like a good deal. The Tea Act permitted the corporation to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, decreasing prices, and giving a luxury commodity at a bargain, a few pence cheaper. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Because the problem wasn't the price of tea. It was the idea behind it. The Tea Act retained the despised levy on tea firmly in place. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, would signify accepting Parliament's power to tax the colonies without their assent. To many Americans, that was unfathomable, a loss of the liberties they had struggled to safeguard for more than a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread like wildfire through the colonies. Merchants fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would kill local trade. Patriots raged at the concealed message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it liked. In Boston, the reaction was extremely intense. Already a city wounded by the Boston Massacre and years of economic struggle, Bostononians saw the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a litmus test for allegiance to the cause of liberty. Public meetings swelled, newspaper columns ignited with furious invective. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, established boycotts, swearing that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or sipped on American land. All across the colonies, ships bringing the contentious tea were turned away by local resistance. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was plain: we will not be purchased. But in Boston, fate twisted differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleni, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored in the harbor, and sat there, refusing to go. Royal officials requested the tea be unloaded. The colonists declined. A stalemate grew, taut as a drawn bow ring. The anxiety was awful. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same again. As the British tea ship stood firmly parked in Boston Harbor, the city itself morphed into a powder bomb. Every day that passed without resolution intensified the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting, it was prepared for a fight. In bars, churches, and public squares, enraged colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery speakers like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved fast to organize resistance. They placed public notices calling for citizens to boycott British tea and staged raucous meetings that swelled with farmers, artisans, and merchants alike. Each collecting gave fuel to the inferno. The historic South Meeting House became the nerve core of the opposition. Thousands jammed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in defiance. Here, resolutions were passed, speeches were made, and tempers boiled. Each vote against the unloading of tea was another hammer blow against British authority. But while the people of Boston remained united, the clock was ticking. British legislation stipulated that imported products like tea be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships lingered after the deadline, customs officers would take the cargo and the levy would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty realized that once the levy was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would tolerate being treated as subjects without rights, or whether they would stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to let the tea ships leave without discharging their cargo, demanding that the law be obeyed. Colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down meant conceding that crowds, not kings, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a spectacle. Every man, woman, and kid knew that something was coming. You could feel it in the air, that cold, acute sense before a storm, when the planet pauses its breath. All it would take was one spark to ignite an explosion. And somewhere among the busy streets and crowded hearts of Boston, a decision was quietly taking shape. A strategy that would resound across oceans and empires. December 16th, 1773 dawned bleak and cold over Boston, a city perched on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbor like ticking bombs. Now the final deadline had arrived. According to British legislation, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days after a ship's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officials may seize the goods, and British troops could be brought in to execute the law. Everyone knew it, but everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists accepted it, even once, their cause, their claim to rights and liberty would collapse. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and other colonists poured into the Old South Meeting House, the largest edifice in town. Some had trekked kilometers through the freezing countryside to be there. The assembly was so packed that men poured out onto the streets, trying to hear the furious speeches booming through the rooms. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of insurrection, presided over the assemblage. Speaker after speaker rose to criticize the Tea Act, to scream out against tyranny, to urge quick action. But even among the defiants, uncertainty remained heavy. What could be done without starting actual war? How could they halt the tea without opening the floodgates to violent retaliation? As the afternoon drew on, horses rushed in with terrible news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unimpressed. The ships would not be allowed to leave without emptying. The tea would be taken, the tax collected, the king's law executed. The crowd hummed with wrath. The walls of the meeting house seemed to quake with the intensity of it. Yet Samuel Adams stood calmly and said the words that indicated the end of argument. "This assembly can do nothing more to preserve the country." A simple sentence, but everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more concessions. Action would be taken. Outside, a war yell broke through the approaching gloom. The signal. Men disguised themselves swiftly, smearing soot on their faces, wearing blankets and feathers in clumsy imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about producing a sign, a statement no one could misinterpret. The deadline had gone. Boston would answer, not with words, but with resistance. As nightfall descended over Boston on December 16th, 1773, the peaceful streets began to stir. Figures moved in the shadows. Boston said, average men covered in rough blankets, their faces stained with soot, some ornamented with feathers. Or the then moved by Demuth, hopefully of lasting new contract. These weren't trying to trick anyone into believing these were actual Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act of shedding their old identities, of taking a stance as something new, something powerful. By the dozens, they made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbor water churned cold and dark beneath them, dense with a keen bite of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken turmoil. This was not a riot. It was a task, carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few crew members left aboard. No damage happened to the sailors. They were moved aside, watched in silence as the operation began. Men ripped open the wooden trunks with expert strokes, the rich smell of fresh tea flowing into the cool night air. Others heaved the containers overboard, their huge splashes ringing across the quiet waters of the bay. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was broken and poured, until the black water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf, mute, moored. British guards stationed nearby made no move to intervene. Whether from confusion, pity, or fear of rising violence remains unclear. Some sources show that even among British loyalists, there was an understanding. Something had altered, and there would be no stopping it tonight. The discipline was outstanding. No cargo was stolen. No one plundered the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the dreaded symbol of British rule, was targeted. In a place where hunger and poverty were daily realities, the men might have easily transformed the protest into a pretext for theft. They did not. When it was over, the port resembled a vast churning cauldron, filled with torn chests and wet tea leaves. The smell of the sea blended with the harsh tang of broken tea, filling the night air with a weird, bittersweet flavor. The task was done. Silently, the guards withdrew into the night, going into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to glory, only the undeniable trace of revolt. As the last broken containers bobbed in the dark ocean, Boston remained still, nearly holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It was something considerably rarer, an act of cold, purposeful disobedience, done out under the veil of night. The port was converted into a big, spinning teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in large mats on the water, turning it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, picked handfuls of damp leaves from the water, only to be scolded by the Sons of Liberty monitoring the docks. Nothing was to be rescued. No one would profit from this night's work. This was principle, pure and simple. The community woke the next morning to the fragrance of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. News spread like wildfire. Word of mouth, letters, large sheets. By midday, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had transpired. And opinions split rapidly. Among patriots there was pride, a strong, surging pride that ordinary individuals had risen up against the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates there was dread. To them, the destruction of property was reckless, hazardous. Had the colonies crossed a line they couldn't walk back from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson screamed in his house, enraged not only at the wreckage, but at the message it communicated. If the king's authority could be resisted so boldly in Boston, where else might insurrection spark? British officials were startled. They had expected protests, boycotts, maybe another riot like those that had broken out after the Stamp Act. They hadn't expected organized, disciplined rebels to peacefully destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal goods without so much as breaking a glass. The ship's captains, the Dartmouth, the Alelaninia, the Beaver, could only watch helplessly as their cargo disappeared beneath the waters. In the official ledgers, the night's loss would be calculated at over £10,000 British pounds, a fortune. But the actual damage wasn't measured in pounds sterling or spoiled tea. It was measured in trust, in loyalty, in the frail delusion that Britain still ruled her colonies with consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper surged to the surface. A common, incontrovertible truth. The age of peaceful protest was ending. A reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready. When word of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction was swift and ferocious. To British officials, it was not simply a protest, it was insurrection. an open, mocking challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored. King George III, upon receiving the news, was believed to have gone frigid with fury. Parliament, already exasperated by years of colonial disobedience, burst in wrath. They demanded retribution, not just for the city of Boston, but as a message to all the American colonies. The consequence was a series of legislation so harsh they were rapidly termed the insufferable acts in America. The first blow came soon, the Boston Port Act. In one cruel stroke, Parliament ordered the shutdown of Boston's thriving waterfront, the economic lifeline of the city, until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored. Ships could no longer arrive or leave. Trade vanished. Goods and supplies dried up. Boston, once bustling and loud, grew quiet, its ports eerily calm. But the punishment didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act deprived the colony of its self-governing rights, placing it firmly under the king's selected officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officers accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain, a strong indication that British authority were untouchable. And to make sure the colonies understood force was an option, British soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the exact inhabitants they were meant to conquer. The message was plain. Rebellion would be suppressed. Liberty was a luxury the Crown would no longer accept. But Parliament's hard hand had an unforeseen effect. Instead of intimidating the other colonies into surrender, it angered them. News of Boston's agony of its port closed, its people starving under martial control, provoked profound compassion and justified fury throughout America. Wagon loads of food and supplies came into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of encouragement, pledges of solidarity, and secret meetings began to tie the previously split colonies closer together. What had formerly been a Massachusetts concern was gradually becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had hoped to make an example of them. Instead, they made Boston a symbol, a rallying cry for opposition. The fires of revolution, formerly burning in isolated places, suddenly began to blaze from colony to colony, and there would be no simple extinguishing them. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond the rugged beaches of Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, outrage morphed into something considerably more perilous for Britain: unity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, arguing and competing, separated by geography, religion, and trade rivalries. But when Parliament slammed Boston's harbor shut and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, Americans throughout the continent knew if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anybody. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the answer was immediate. Colonists sent wagons loaded of food, supplies, and notes of solidarity to the suffering people of Boston. Town meetings buzzed with rage. Newspaper printers toiled day and night to share the news. The fight was no longer Boston's alone, it was everyone's. And so, in September 1774, something unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies assembled under one roof to negotiate a cohesive response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, previously only regional characters, now stood together as architects of a movement that was growing greater by the day. Their goal, at least officially, was not yet full independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the old relationship of mutual respect under the British monarch. But underneath the polite conversations and well-phrased petitions, a deeper understanding was taking root. The colonies could no longer afford to stand separately. At the Congress, they agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods. They pledged mutual solidarity in the event of additional British assault, and they made it plain any attack on one colony would be deemed an attack on all. In taverns and meeting rooms across the continent, regular people began speaking terms that had formerly been spoken only in private: unity, resistance, liberty. In bringing the hammer down on Boston, Britain had assumed it would squash rebellion. Instead, it had fused the colonies together into something even more terrible: a people who, despite their differences, were beginning to think of themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer only stirring, they were gathering into a storm, and it was too late for Britain to stop it. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't simply boxes that were destroyed. It was the delusion that the American colonies might remain loyal subjects forever. The Boston Tea Party kindled a light that no king, no army, no faraway parliament could ever put out. In the months that followed, that spark caught fire across the colonies. What had formerly been protests, boycotts, and polite petitions hardened into open defiance. Town militias began drilling openly, storehouses stocked with powder and shot. Men who had formerly hailed King George III in bars now muttered of revolt under the same roofs. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, damaged but unbowed. The more Britain tried to tighten its grasp, the more the colonies slipped through its fingers. Every ship that went past the locked, silent harbor of Boston was a silent warning that oppression had met its match in American rebellion. When Parliament imposed the Intolerable Acts, they planned to make an example out of Boston, to scare the other colonies into submission. Instead, they had constructed a martyr city, a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists knew that their fates were intertwined together. Resistance was no longer about tea. It was about survival, identity, independence. By the spring of 1775, the tension reached a boiling point outside Boston. In the communities of Lexington and Salem, British troops intended to take colonial guns, instead encountered armed farmers, ordinary men eager to protect their rights with musket fire. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out, a clear line traced back to the moment when men chose principle over profit and spilled a fortune's worth of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party showed the world that revolution doesn't necessarily announce itself with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it starts softly, with a small number of dedicated people standing in the cold, choosing resistance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't only rejecting a tax, they were rejecting an empire. And if the road ahead would be deadly, cruel, and unclear, one thing had become obvious that night in Boston Harbor. The American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. All before the Great Pyramids of Giza, before Mesopotamian towns swarmed with life, before Stonehenge loomed against the sky, there was Corel. Hidden away in the parched valleys of coastal Peru, Corel rose in silent magnificence nearly 5,000 years ago, then faded into near utter oblivion, devoured by sands and forgotten by history. For centuries, the world did not even know it existed. The giant valley, where Corel once thrived, looks at first glance an improbable setting for civilization to bloom. The environment is arid, bleak, the river barely more than a tiny silver thread winding between rocks and dust. To most eyes, it looked unfriendly, a place abandoned by life. Yet it was here, amid the desolation, that one of humanity's earliest great cities took birth. Corral wasn't just a collection of dispersed huts or a transitory trading site. It was a planned metropolis, extending over 150 acres replete with pyramids, plazas, residential quarters, and ceremonial places. It had scale, purpose, and vision. The complex society, flourishing centuries before the Egyptians began stacking stones into pyramids of their own. The people of Corral achieved this without the wheel, without written language, without metal tools. They erected gigantic structures from stone and dirt with nothing but inventiveness, collective work, and the raw power of human will. Yet for thousands of years, Corral's existence remained a secret. Even when travelers stumbled across the weird, weathered mounds dispersed across the valley, they believed them for natural structures, ordinary hills molded by the desert winds. No one imagined that beneath the sand lied one of the oldest cities in the world, predating even the civilizations that history books had crowned as the firsts. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists led by Ruth Shoddy revealed the truth. What they uncovered, buried in the dust of time, would rewrite the tale of the Americas and force the world to reevaluate what it believed it knew about the beginnings of civilization itself. Corral had risen, prospered, and collapsed in absolute anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence, its stones are speaking again, talking of a peaceful, intellectual people who fashioned a world of intricacy and wonder in a land where existence itself seemed impossible. And this was simply the beginning of their story. At first glance, the Sup Valley looks like a location where life should struggle to exist. Harsh gusts sweep across limitless areas of sand and stone. The sun beats down brutally, drying out the dirt, burning the countryside into fractured, brittle sheets. Water is sparse, the river a meandering thread striving for survival. To the untrained eye, it is a wasteland, desolate, abandoned, neglected by the gods. But the people of Corral saw something different. They did not see a desert to be afraid. They saw a canvas to be shaped. They saw the river, however tiny, as the lifeblood of possibilities. And so, with patience, inventiveness, and sheer resolve, they turned this inhospitable area into a bustling oasis of life and culture. Their first victory was agriculture. They learned to regulate the river's yearly floods, developing simple yet ingenious irrigation systems that diverted water across the valley floor. Where others saw sand and dust, they nurtured green sprouts of hope. Cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton, in particular, became their treasure. It was woven into fishing nets and textiles, driving trade with coastal towns and forming bonds that reached far beyond their desert home. But cultivating food was only part of their ability.
the residents of Corral realized that survival in the desert requires balance. They worked with nature, not against it. They built their dwellings and plazas from stone and earth suited to endure both blazing heat and the rare, severe rains that occasionally swept over the valley. They studied the stars and seasons, arranging their harvests with the precision of skilled astronomers. Trade became the veins and arteries of Corral's economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handmade products flowed up and down the coast. In exchange, Corral received exotic things, colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the Andes, ideas from distant peoples. They were not isolated. They were connected. In a land where existence appeared impossible, Corral prospered through intelligence, innovation, and community. They didn't conquer the desert with brute force. They partnered with it, knowing its rhythms, honoring its strength, forging a society that was not merely functional. It was incredible. Against the odds, Corral flowered into a beacon of civilization, and it was only beginning to grow, rising out of the desert like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Corral. Contradict everything we thought we understood about early civilization in the Americas. These were not little, rudimentary constructions created by primitive hands. They were vast, purposeful works of architecture, constructed by a people with vision, organization, and ambition. The centerpiece of the city was the Pyramid Mayor, the largest of Corral's gigantic constructions. It spanned more than 450 feet in length and towered about 60 feet above the desert plain. A marvel of engineering on par with the early wonders of the ancient world. Built from stone, mud, and woven reed sacks filled with rocks, the pyramid was meant not simply to weather the severe climate, but to withstand the devastating earthquakes that periodically jolted the region. And endure it did, remaining motionless against wind and time for nearly 5 millennia. But the pyramids of Corral were not tombs. Unlike the vast tomb complexes of Egypt, Corral's pyramids served a different purpose. They were centers of ritual, power, and public life. Temples and gathering areas adorned their heights, accessible by large, graceful stairs. Fires formerly blazed atop of these platforms, and rites were held beneath the infinite Peruvian sky. At the foot of the pyramids, large plazas sprang up, sunken and circular, allowing thousands to gather for religious rites, political meetings, and communal celebrations. The very shape of Corral's cityscape implied a society that respected community and order, a people deeply connected to one another and to the cosmos. Around the pyramids, smaller residential complexes branched out, perhaps home to priests, bureaucrats, artists, and farmers. The pyramids themselves seem to have been intentionally placed, synchronized with astronomical phenomena, sunrises, solstices, the cycles of the stars. To the people of Corral, architecture wasn't merely utilitarian. It was spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. Walking amid the aged stones now, it's almost impossible not to experience a peculiar sensation of wonder. These structures were raised without metal tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Yet they rose with symmetry, scale, and startling accuracy. The enormous pyramids of Corral were not built for vanity nor for conflict. They were constructed to connect earth and sky, community and universe, humanity, and eternity. And they still murmur across the sands, revealing a story that refuses to be forgotten. Among the remains of Caral, there is something fundamentally distinctive, something that sets it apart from so many old civilizations. No weaponry have been found buried beneath the sands. No defensive walls circle its plazas. No mass burials suggest at brutal conquest or internal warfare. Unlike the kingdoms that rose and collapsed through battle, Caral was a community built on peace. It's a revelation that defies expectations. Here was a culture that grew not through bloodshed but by cooperation, trade, and common belief. The people of Caral seem to have invested their energies not in armies or strongholds, but in architecture, astronomy, music, and communal life. Their plazas and pyramids weren't memorials of victory against adversaries. They were centers of celebration, worship, and governance. This was a culture that decided to gather rather than invade, to negotiate rather than destroy. Trade was the lifeblood of Caral's success. Cotton cultivated along the rich riverbanks was spun into fishing nets that were exchanged with coastal towns. In return, Caral received dried fish, a vital source of protein, and unusual things from far distant places. One beautiful shells from the Pacific, rich stones from the highlands, and even exotic tropical fruits from remote regions. This extensive network of trade knitted the region together, linking far-flung towns into a harmonious web of mutual benefit. And, in the midst of it all, Caral thrived as a cultural and economic hub. Religious and ceremonial life had a significant role in maintaining societal cohesion. The city's great public areas and sunken plazas presumably served as platforms for ceremonies that unified the population under shared spiritual beliefs. Music permeated these meetings. Flutes cut from condor bones, drums constructed from deer hides, producing soundscapes that resonated across the desert, linking individual lives to something greater. Leadership, however, looked to rely less on military strength and more on spiritual authority and civic organization. The city's officials must have coordinated large construction projects, seasonal agricultural cycles, and sophisticated trade deals, all without leaving behind the ugly scars of conflict. In an ancient world so frequently defined by violence, Caral stands as a shining example, a reminder that civilization does not have to rise on the shattered backs of the conquered. It can instead be built by the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. At Caral, the stone still seemed to pulse with echoes of a world long gone. It was not merely a metropolis of buildings and trade. It was a city alive with sound, ceremony, and spiritual beat. Music and ritual were intertwined into the very heartbeat of Caral society. Archaeologists excavating carefully through the dry sands uncovered a treasure trove of ancient instruments, flutes constructed from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles fashioned from deer antlers, miniature drums stretched with animal hides. These items were not mere toys. They were manufactured with care, adjusted to certain notes, designed to transport sound across the large open plazas of the city. In a world without written language,
Music speaks the language of the soul. Imagine it. The low thrum of drums rising at nightfall, flutes keening like the desert wind, feet stamping on the sunken plazas as hundreds gathered under the dying light. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid platforms. Priests clad in complex, woven clothes would chant to the gods of the river, the ground, the stars. In those moments, Corral was not merely a city, it was a symphony. The arrangement of Corral itself implies that ceremonial life was at its core. The magnificent plazas were not mere open places. They were stages for communal ceremonies, meticulously intended to pull people together. The deep circular courts acted like ancient amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight onto the rites performed at their centers. And above them all, the pyramids loomed, not as cemeteries, but as sacred mountains erected by human hands, joining the ground to the heavens. Rituals presumably marked the turning of the seasons, the cycles of sowing and harvest, the movements of the stars. Music was not merely entertainment, it was a bridge between humans, between nature and the divine, between the known and the mysteries beyond. No terrible murals, no fearsome gods of war, no savage sacrifices. In Corral, the spiritual world seems to have been one of harmony, joy, and veneration. Even now, as the desert wind whistles through the remains, you can almost hear it. The faint notes of antique music, the lost melodies of a people who discovered beauty, meaning, and connection in the center of the harsh, endless sands. Corral wasn't just a center of song, trade, and ritual. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a testimony to human ingenuity in one of the toughest settings on Earth. Without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, the people of Corral created a city of stone and soil that has endured nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements were remarkable. Massive pyramids emerged from the desert floor, made not with small, flimsy bricks, but with massive stones transported across the parched valley. Workers hauled pebbles using reed bags, innovative baskets robust enough to hold enormous weights, made from the very plants that flourished along the riverbanks. Layer upon layer, they erected with care, stacking stone and filled the interiors with rubble to create constructions that could survive not only time, but nature's fury. And they understood nature well. Corral located in a zone prone to strong earthquakes, yet their pyramids and plazas survived mostly intact. How? By mastering earthquake-resistant architecture. Builders used flexible building techniques, layered infill, wide foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. It was engineering produced not from textbooks, but from an intimate knowledge of the planet itself. Water management was another silent triumph. Despite living in a desert, the people of Corral constructed complex irrigation systems. Channels and canals carefully diverted river water to their agricultural areas, allowing crops to flourish even during drought seasons. No water was wasted. Every drop mattered. The layout of Corral itself demonstrated excellent urban planning. Major buildings aligned with significant astronomical locations, demonstrating a thorough awareness of the solar cycles. The subterranean plazas, with their exact shape, were more than gathering spaces. They were equipment for tracking the heavens, allowing priests and astronomers to foretell seasons important for survival. Even the city's organization spoke of a complicated civilization. Residential zones, administrative regions, ceremonial centers, all were structured in harmony, blending communal life with sacred spaces. but built not just for the present, but for centuries. Today, as modern engineers marvel at Carl's durability, they are reminded that excellence is not judged by technology alone. Sometimes the ultimate wisdom resides in recognizing the powers of nature, in working with the land, not against it. Carl's stones have weathered storms, quakes, and the erosion of time itself. They exist as a mute witness to a civilization that engineered their dreams into the arid sands. For centuries, the city of Carroll prospered, a light of peace, music, trade, and architectural mastery in the desert sands. And then, softly, almost without a trace, it was abandoned. No fires marked its fall. No signs of conquest damage its walls. No mass graves or smashed monuments reveal a story of quick tragedy. Instead, Carroll simply disappeared. Its plazas empty, its pyramids left to the drifting sands, its flutes and drums muted by time. Why did they leave? That question still hangs like a ghost across the vast valley. Some researchers feel that environmental change inflicted the ultimate blow. Evidence implies that a protracted period of drought may have damaged Carroll's agriculture. Without the river's life-giving waters, the fields would have withered. Trade networks depending on extra cotton and grain would have crumbled. The careful balance Carroll had maintained with its tough surroundings may have ultimately gone beyond repair. Other ideas point to altering trading routes. As adjacent cultures evolved and new centers of power emerged along the coast and interior, Carroll's influence might have declined. Perhaps the things they had supplied, cotton, fish, produce, were no longer enough to sustain their role as a leading city. Slowly, the lifeblood of commerce seeped away. Still others whisper of internal decay. Without written documents, we can only envision political battles, religious upheaval, or simple tiredness after centuries of growth. Even peaceful civilizations can disintegrate under pressure when existence becomes questionable. Whatever the cause, the exodus seems to have been gradual, not sudden. Families undoubtedly slipped away one by one, seeking more fertile valleys, stronger rivers, fresh beginnings. Children, who previously ran over Carroll's plazas, grew up recounting stories of a lost metropolis behind them. Stories that would soon fade into folklore. The desert recovered what humanity had made. Winds carried fine sand over stone monuments. Flutes lie buried beneath shifting sand. What had once been a buzzing, thriving civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Carroll stayed concealed, a whisper beneath the dunes, waiting. Today, as archaeologists meticulously remove its stones, the question still burns. How could a city so advanced, so elegantly designed, suddenly vanish? Perhaps the fact is that even the greatest civilizations, no matter how smart or peaceful, are nonetheless fragile. Threads sewn into the tapestry of time, perpetually vulnerable to the invisible forces of change. For millennia, Carroll remained forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Great Valley. Travelers passed the unusual rounded hills that studded the area, never thinking that beneath their feet lay the remnants of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, these were just natural landforms, mounds sculpted by the wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world would finally hear Carroll's voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, driven by curiosity and a growing sense that these hills might store secrets no one had yet found. What they unearthed would change the tale of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by tedious layer, the sand was swept away. Beneath it came walls of neatly cut stone,
Huge stairs, subterranean plazas, pyramids, a city far older than anyone could have dreamed. Radioarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Corral was nearly 4,600 years old, thriving at the same time as the oldest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a revelation that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Corral, academics believed that civilization in the Americas arose considerably later, shadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Corral altered everything. It revealed that the Americas had spawned massive, building, complex urban life and social order independently long before the rise of the Incas or the Mer. Ruth Shady and her team unearthed not just stone and rubble, but the vestiges of life, musical instruments, fishing nets, fabrics, ancient knot records, and even offerings offered to the gods. Each relic presented a story of a people who had established a society with vision, intelligence, and remarkable creativity. Corral's revelation was more than an intellectual achievement. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slumbered beneath the desert for thousands of years now stood uncovered under the open sky once more, its plazas touched by the same winds that had formerly carried the strains of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Corral is listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a delicate, valuable link to humanity's early dreams of constructing, belonging, and believing. The dunes had hidden Corral well, but in the end, the stones endured, waiting for someone to listen, to see, to remember. Corral stands now as a silent giant, a reminder that civilization's roots go far deeper than we originally assumed. Among its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones speak a story that reshapes our perception of humanity's journey. A story not of conquering and bloodshed, but of harmony, innovation, and optimism. Long before the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or perhaps Egypt, the people of Corral were building something incredible. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They plotted the stars without written records. They established a prosperous culture anchored upon trade, music, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving scars of battle upon the soil. In a period typically marked by war, Corral provides another vision of what society can be. A society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over rule. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence, that greatness is not judged by how many soldiers march across a battlefield, but by how a community joins together to develop, to create, to dream. Corral's legacy stretches well beyond the barren sands of the Soup Valley. It contradicts conventional notions that civilization had a single cradle, but urban life and colossal architecture belonged initially to the Old World. Corral illustrates that humanity's spirit of creativity and aspiration arose independently in numerous corners of the world, fashioned by diverse hands, but motivated by the same eternal yearning to persevere, to rejoice, to grasp for the holy. Today, walking among Corral's ancient remnants, you can almost hear it. The pulse of drums, the low buzz of flutes, the murmur of dealers bartering in the plazas, the laughter of children dashing down stone lanes under a sky of limitless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories are still with us, carved into the bones of the soil. Corral tells us that even when civilizations crumble, their spirit may persist, sleeping under sands, yearning to be remembered, ready to inspire again. In the great timeline of human history,
corral shines not merely as a remnant of the past, but as a beacon for the future. A reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, knowledge, and serenity can take root and develop a world that aims for the heavens.